All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. Today we're going to be having a quick book talk with Reeve. She is a correspondent with CNN. We're going to be talking about her latest book called Black Pill: How I Witnessed the Darkest Corners of the Internet Come to Life, Poison Society, and Capture American Politics. This book recently came out, and I had the pleasure of reading it cover to cover, and I really enjoyed it. It's an excellent showcase of Ellie's talents as a writer and a reporter, and it really captures the essence of kind of how the American far right or alt right kind of evolved over the last decade, and kind of got us to where we are now. Um, so without further ado, I will give Ellie the chance to introduce herself, kind of talk about what inspired her to write the book, and then we will get into a few questions that I have for her about the book itself and talk about some of the finer details.
Hi, I'm Elle Reeve. I'm a correspondent at CNN. Previously, was at Vice. We had a show on HBO. Um, and I started covering the far right almost on accident. I stumbled onto 4chan on a day of high activity, and I realized that it was truly like a massive number of people who'd become radicalized and a different type of person. I covered the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and a lot of people asked me to write a book, but I was kind of maybe too traumatized. I don't know. I wasn't ready. But then I was at January 6th, and I saw all of these average Americans, older Americans, repeating some of the same things that I'd heard in Charlottesville, but in this different context. And then I watched them storm the Capitol. And that was when I decided I wanted to write about why this pattern keeps repeating.
All right, thank you for that. All right, so firstly, I think the first thing that we kind of need to talk about is the title of the book, Black Pill. Some in our audience might be familiar with, the red pill narrative that's sort of prevalent on the far right or within those sort of communities. So what's different about the red pill versus the black pill?
Right. So the red pill narrative, the red pill metaphor comes from the Matrix, right? The idea that you take the blue pill and stay in a pleasant illusion, red pill, the horrible reality. This has been a very easy piece of slang to manipulate to your own ends. And you even see like Kamala Harris fans saying they're coconut pills, right? But there are all these different pills. But black pill is one that I've seen a lot recurring, and I think is the most important because it's not even about ideas, it's about a mindset, which is that society is imminently collapsing. It's completely morally bankrupt. You want it to collapse because it's an unjust system, and you should maybe even work to hasten its collapse. And anything you do to hasten its collapse is then a good thing. You don't have to obey its morals and ethics and laws because they were created by corrupt people. And I
That's
think,
yeah.
yeah, this is a mindset that allows people to talk themselves into
Mhm.
violence.
Yeah, that's sort of the thing that we see a lot, especially within research when we look at sort of the accelerationist bent of extremists. If you think of the Adam Waffens, if you think of the base folks, they're sort of along those same lines. But I think what differentiates them between what differentiates them from some of the people that you cover in this book is that the people like the base, Adam Offen, everything like that, they're more so bent on massive violence. Um, and what I think you did a really good job of portraying in the book is that um, a lot of these people are just sort of internet trolls and not exactly willing to take um, their ideas into real life. And they just sort of festered on, some of the corners of the internet for a while until it kind of spilled over into Charlottesville on January 6th, of course. Um, so while I think there are some similarities there, um, I don't think, a lot of them are super bent on acts of mass violence and, pure terror like
Right.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
More destabilization or getting people to accept more radical answers. There's a popular idea now called Caesarism, which is that to enact the change that America's needs, we need a dictator to force that through anti-democratic means.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, that's a Curtis Yarvin sort of
That's right.
idea.
That's right.
Yeah.
Curtis Garvin connected to Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance,
Hmm.
other elites.
Yeah. Yeah. So, starting with, getting into the book itself, you kind of start off by telling the story of this interesting character who kind of, forms the base for the rest of the book. His name is Frederick Brennan, and he's the creator of 8chan. So the beginning is sort of a wild ride through the early days of internet sites where this black pill idea sort of originated. Um, so can you tell us a little bit more about one, who Frederick is, as a person, as a programmer, or as, sort of an influencer within this space? And what do you think his role is in creating the conditions where these sort of far ecosystems can thrive online?
So Frederick Brennan, truly his life, I think, has shaped the course of American history because of the very particular circumstances of his birth and his personality. Was it was obvious from the moment he was able to talk that he was a very, very smart young man. Like by 5, he could read the newspaper, according to neighbors. He was hyper literate. But he was also born with brittle bone disease, which makes your bones break very easily. They grow curved instead of straight. So he's 3 feet tall, can't walk, couldn't play with other kids without risking a very painful injury. It hurts just as much to break his bones as a regular person. So when he was a teenager, he was put into foster care and he was very angry and sad and wanted to understand why he was in this situation. And he got very good at computers and he found 4chan, this anonymous message board filled with trolls. It was already starting to circulate among neo-Nazis. And he asked them, like, why am I in this situation? Why am I stuck in foster care in this dinky little place? And their answer was because your mom, who has this disability, was allowed to have children, and the government should have not allowed that. And that really set the stage for his anger at the world. Um, as a teenager, he created 8chan, a version of 4chan with even more free speech, even less rules about what could be posted. He harnessed the power of Gamergate to grow this site, and it became a major hub of white nationalist posting. It became a place where people posted their mass shooter manifestos, such as the Christchurch shooter, and it became the home of QAnon. And eventually, Fred, he's one of the rare people who realized he created a monster and decided to do something to try to stop that.
So what sort of inspired Frederick to kind of abandon the idea, or at least using 4chan, and what sort of inspired him to create 8chan instead? So was there something that wasn't good enough about 4chan for him, as opposed to what he could create with 8chan?
Um, Fred had gotten into what was called alternative chans, what he calls. Anyway, he got onto a site called Wizard Chan, which is for adult male virgins. A wizard being slang for someone who reaches the age of 30 without having sex, because then you get magic powers. So Fred had been a moderator there, or he had run the site, and then a woman contacted him, asked whether he'd like to lose his virginity. They had a relationship. She introduced him to psychedelic mushrooms, and while on this mushroom trip, he thought, what if users could make their own boards, much like Reddit? So on this trip, he's still high. He registers the domain, and then he sees that some weeks later that Gamergate has been kicked off of 4chan. Gamergate was this kind of harassment campaign of women in the video game industry. And so he worked with other sort of figures like trolls in that world to hype up his site and make it a place where you could even be more free. You could be even more free than on 4chan. You could coordinate harassment of these women on his website.
Yeah, so he kind of saw 4chan not so much as the bastion of free speech that he once thought it was. So he wanted to go off and, kind of take that to a new extreme.
Yeah, his ideas were like he bought into this idea that, in a truly free marketplace of ideas, they'll fight each other out and the best ideas will rise to the top. But that is absolutely not what happened, because neo-Nazis are really unpleasant to be around and they scare everyone else away. And after a while, either the people who were not Nazis become radicalized in that way, and the other people leave. And so there's just one idea just pinging around in there, fascism.
Yeah. So a lot of voices always, end up floating to the top in that situation.
No.
So sort of moving on in the next chapter, you kind of talk about the former leader of the NSM or the National Socialist Movement, and his name is Jeff Scoop. Something that I think they highlighted was that he noticed that there is a clear difference between this quote unquote new generation of sort of far right activists and figures kind of within the milieu. Um, but between the new generation and the sort of brash skinheads, street fighters that he grew up, he came up with in the movement. Um, what were some of those differences that he touched on, and did you notice anything that he didn't while you were kind of interacting with him and getting to know him? And do you think he captured any differences between the generations? Do you think he kind of captured any of those well?
So Scoop got into white nationalism, which he has also since denounced, in the late 80s. And it was hard. He had to go to a library. He found a academic book about white nationalists. And in the back was an index with these people's addresses. So he painstakingly wrote letters to them all and waited and waited and waited for them to reply. And sometimes they took forever, or they'd send really old literature. He was really disappointed. Finally, he found a Christian nationalist at a book fair who hooked him up. But it was very difficult to become a white nationalist. Then at the time, he mostly recruited men like himself, working class, maybe they'd had some experience with violence. And in his old writing, you see he thought of himself as a protector of white womanhood. I mean, this is, lynching also was often centered around protecting women from Black men. So 2014, 2015, 2016 comes around, the alt-right comes online. It is much more influenced by that incel culture that Fred was a part of, which has become very bitter and angry at women for feminism and for denying them the right to a sexual relationship. So he sees white nationalists joking about he sees a meme, he called it a poster, but he sees a meme of a beaten up white woman sort of suggesting that white women deserved to be mistreated. And he was outraged by it. He's like, in my day, some guy posts that, he'll get a boot party, meaning he'll get beat up by a bunch of us. Like, they'll kick him in the face with his boots. So, but these guys were all laughing and saying it was just ironic. It was just a joke. But in that time, he saw much wealthier men. He thought of them as girly boys, snotty rich kid types, suddenly trying to appeal to like this GQ idea of masculinity. It was so alien to them. And all these adult men were obsessed with this cartoon frog. We all know Pepe, right? We've all seen that on Twitter. He's like, I just don't understand. Like, why does this adult man, what does he see in this cartoon frog? He thought it was all bizarre, right? And this guy, he knew murderers. He knew someone who had killed his own family and himself. He knew murder victims, a man who'd been killed by his own child, right? So he'd been through all of that. And then when the alt-right comes around, he's like, whoa, like this is truly weird. What
And
I
then do you
think,
think that, yeah, go ahead.
well, what I think Scoop he did not take credit for, but I think is interesting, is that that street level experience, he had interacted with the deterrent effect of federal law enforcement. So when people would come into his group saying extremely violent things, he would take them aside and say, like, this is your only warning. You're only saying that because you're crazy or you're a Fed. And so you'll get kicked out, right? He didn't want violent language within his group because it posed a legal risk. And he freely admits, like, this wasn't about morals. But when the alt-right came around, like, they didn't have that kind of experience, and they didn't do that kind of moderation within their online communities. And that is how the violent rhetoric ramped up.
And then do you think that kind of created a schism between sort of the different generations? Because Scoop
Oh
kind of came
yeah.
up in that, Street Fighter, area nations, we're going to kick everybody with our Doc Martens sort of era.
Mhm.
And you see these people like Richard Spencer dressed in three-piece suits going on college speaking tours, um, and everything like that. And I think that kind of hits on some of um, a lot of the differences within class that kind of permeate throughout the movement. And I think that really moves in nicely to my next sort of question or point that I want to hit on is with Matthew Heimbach and Matt Parrott.
Mhm.
Um, they're two interesting people to say the least. I remember when I had to have been maybe a junior or senior in college, and I saw the Vice piece about Matthew Heimbach starting the White Student Union.
Yeah.
Then he eventually transitions to Traditionalist Workers Party. Um, but I think the thing that I want to hit on with those two is how you kind of write about the prevalence of autism or autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and one thing I noticed was that they all, either said they had autism or were diagnosed with it formally. They had, you know, strained paternal relationships, whether it's with their father primarily. Yeah, I know
Mhm.
Heimbach really hit on that from what I read in your book, and sort of their personal stories of social isolation and academic achievement. Um, so how do you think that those kind of backgrounds drew them into the alt-right? And what do you think that means for young men that might find themselves in a similar situation to them or coming from a similar background?
Right. So um, both Heimbach and Parrott were diagnosed with Asperger's as kids. That's no longer in the DSM. It's just all autism spectrum disorder. If you go in these extremist communities and also in like crypto, like in all kinds of like intense online communities, you will see this word autist, AUTIST. It means someone who embodies the traits of autism. I cannot prove whether these anonymous people were diagnosed, but I do have those I talk to who actually have a diagnosis. And what they identify with in this in autism is high intelligence, a lack of social skills, a feeling of alienation from society, and this like confusing social rules, and an obsession with like just pure facts. So for Parrot especially, but for most of these guys, the book The Bell Curve by Charles Murray is very, very important. It argues that IQ is innate, inheritable, cannot be changed, and that certain racial groups have more of it than others, right? So this was very dear to the heart of Matt Parrott. It's right. It's a way of saying social inequality is not a problem that needs to be changed, right? It's just the natural outcome of differences in IQ. So stop trying to make me feel bad about poor people because it's their fault for being poor. Um, Likewise, Matt Heimbach, he he scoffed at these journalists who would say, "Oh, like, were black kids bullied you? Did they bully you in elementary school, or do you hate your dad? Like, why are you into this?" And he would say, "No, bro, I'm an autist. Like, I got into it for the charts." But later, of course, Heimbach told me he did actually hate his dad, that he resented his dad as this suburban guy who was constantly striving for external validation from his job while he neglected his family. And he felt that his dad had not offered him masculine skills like how to fish or how to train a dog. And so he hated the suburbs. He wanted to burn and salt the suburbs. And what was the one thing that the suburbs hate? Like, what was the one symbol of everything they were against? Fascism? Okay, like, give me an armband. He started ordering like an SS flag on Amazon when he was in high school. The other element that you touched on is class. And again, these guys, so Heimbach and Parrott tried to portray themselves as working class. They're the symbol of their traditionalist workers' party, had like a gear and a pitchfork. Or then there's the Richard Spencer types who try to portray themselves as like elite aristocrat intellectuals. But they're all middle class, actually. And they all kind of have this shame about being middle class and this shame about being from the suburbs. That I think is very strange, right? And it's very evident in their leadership. Whereas in the mass movement of these alt-right guys, they took those symbols of sort of the declining suburbs, like the decaying mall, vaporwave aesthetic, Muzak, all that stuff. They would combine that into their memes and put fascist slogans on top of it.
Interesting. So that's kind of how we got, the fash wave sort of
Yeah,
aesthetic that we see, that's pretty prevalent.
right.
Um,
It's like a Greek statue, an all-white Greek statue with maybe some like lasers or some like faded neon glow all around it. Yeah.
and that's where they kind of get the reject modernity, embrace tradition, or remember what they took from you, or remember what
Right.
you used to have, those sort of
Return.
messages.
Mhm.
Exactly. I think that really touches on sort of, Roger Griffin's, theory or idea of palingenetic nationalism, where fascists want to really go back to this golden era of what a nation used to be, and kind of talk about national revival and making the nation great through its people, to take a more Giovanni Gentili approach.
Yeah,
Um, so there's a short chapter called "Smart People," which I found pretty interesting. I think you hit on a point that I've always thought about for as long as I've been paying attention to this sort of area of studies, that people tend to underestimate some of the figureheads within this movement, or think that they're dumb, um, and they're really not. Can you tell us a little more about why you decided to sort of include this caveat? Because I think whenever I've spoken to um, law enforcement that I've had the opportunities for, or there's been a couple opportunities where we get to speak to students, I always tell them, you can't underestimate these people, and they're not the dumb rednecks that you think they are.
right.
Um, so why did you sort of decide to include that in the book?
Sure. Out of frustration.
Hmm.
At least initially, because so often people would come up to me and be like, oh, these guys, they're all dumbasses, right? And they don't know anything. And I mean, the truth is, like, I end up having to research Heidegger and Nietzsche to like cover them to understand some of the things they're talking about. It's very comforting to imagine that they're idiots because then that's not threatening. It's so easy to beat these dumb rednecks. And by the way, they're dying off anyway. Education is going to take care of all of this. It's like demonstrably not true. Um, but also in it, I see a piece of these guys' ideology because they are obsessed with their own intelligence, right? And I find that sense. It's never stated explicitly, but that sense that smart people are good and, well, let me put it this way, that good people are smart and bad people are dumb, and therefore smart people are good and dumb people are bad. Like there's a little bit of this like almost eugenicist idea embedded in the culture of like the creative professionals that I know in my everyday life. Millennials especially, and some of my sources were plucked in elementary school into the gifted program and told that they were better than all of their peers and they didn't really need to try as hard. They got to be special. And if you go on Reddit, you will find reams and reams of people posting about being former gifted kids and having to come to terms with the fact that they like being good at tests doesn't necessarily make you a good person. And how they had to grapple with that in their own like bad personality.
Yeah. Um, so there's a quote from chapter 9 that I really found captivating, and I'm gonna quote it, directly here. Um, what I've learned reading chat room transcripts and sometimes watching people live is that they talk themselves into committing violence by first talking about self-defense. It doesn't start with talking about punching enemies. It starts with them talking about how violent the enemy is and how they hurt women and the elderly and the vulnerable. Over time, people imagine a very scary villain, and they make themselves afraid, so they psych themselves up to defend the group. Uh, so what I thought this quote did was it kind of perfectly encapsulates some of the gradually escalating narratives that we saw throughout, political discourse, especially in 2020, during the George Floyd protests, and then it eventually spilled over into January 6th. Um, do you think this sort of thinking resonates with the quote unquote normies, who are still kind of trying to find their place along the ideological spectrum, or still trying to find their political bearings to say?
Right. I think this is an example of black pilled thinking. What really, I mean, I had seen that play out uh, in white nationalist message boards, but what really inspired me to write that was going into January 6th. I was following this guy who I had tried to interview because he had a big Trump sign in his yard. He's just a guy in Ohio in cargo shorts with a Trump sign, and he's like jocular and interesting. And um, as I followed him after the election, he got more and more stop the steal pilled, QAnon curious. And he started raising money for people to go to Jan 6. He got like 60-ish people. And he posted this link to their Telegram chat. So I joined it under my real name, but they didn't notice me. And I just watched them and they would talk about red pilling the normies. And I was like, you guys are the normies. Like it was just so jaw dropping. But over time, they start talking about like how afraid they are that Antifa is going to show up. They start talking about like, well, you can't carry brass knuckles, so bring a carabiner because that's illegal and you can use them the same way. Whether or not to use pepper spray, like what kind of weapons to use. I watched a video of their chat as they were preparing. They were like, no quarter, right? Like take no prisoners. Um, they had just completely amped themselves up. And these are just regular people with jobs, like chiropractors, realtors, that kind of thing. And it's just like, it's a cycle that I keep seeing play out over and over again.
Yeah, so I think that kind of touches on a lot of sort of the um, initial breadcrumbs that kind of draws people into it, because eventually, as if they see a lot of this sort of rhetoric, that paints, that otherizes, whether it's along political lines, racial, class, gender, and sex, sexuality, whatever, um, that eventually kind of pushes them to realize, okay, I'm different too. So I need to go and, be with the people that are most like me, because the others, are therefore are a threat. And I think that kind of is what drew people into the alt right and kind of led to some of these, just regular folks, participating in, Unite the Right or January 6th more broadly.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to take not necessarily a step back, but I want to hit on how you sort of included or kind of framed some of these experiences of these people who were in the movement, especially around, the women. And you sort of frame this experience or utilize this woman named Samantha, who found herself in Identity Europa. Um, so what sort of made you want to tell that story, through her lens or through her eyes and the other women that were, a part of that movement?
Well, because they see behind the facade of these guys and their big bravado, about being Chad nationalists, preppy fascists. They get to see the person behind all that macho chest beating. Um, and of course, I was also taken by the extreme misogyny of the movement. I mean, obviously, I received tons and tons and tons of it as a journalist. But I also often had this experience where there would be, like, I'd be at a white nationalist event and there'd be like one woman there. And at the end of it, I'm walking away, the most misogynist thing that someone would say to me that day would be screamed at me by a woman, some kind of version of like dumb slut. And I was like, who are these women? Like I could feel like the self-hate in that, right? Um, so I got Samantha's cell phone from her time in white nationalism. She's also renounced it. It was like this time capsule, unspoiled by Wi-Fi. And what I found in it was while these women might publicly be talking about how great these guys were, how they were like living the trad lifestyle, that they felt protected and loved and respected and sexy. It behind the scenes, when talking to each other, they were very afraid of these guys' violence. Um, they would tell each other, like, I don't trust this man. Like, this guy's dangerous. And like, have you heard about this guy? He's like a little bit creepy. One woman in particular had a boyfriend who was obsessed with the meme white Sharia. The idea, it's like their idea of Sharia law. Um, and because women vote for social liberalism, the only way to bring back the America they want is by stripping women of all rights, not just voting, but the right to have a job. They want child marriage and end of no fault divorce, total subjugation of women, which they say explicitly. Like, I'm not, like, if anything, I'm classing up the things that they would say, right? This is really unspeakable stuff. Um, I mean, this guy wrote a song about rape. So this woman was dating him and she started wearing a burqa, right? Because it was funny and she like had all these public jokes about it. But behind the scenes, she's texting Samantha desperately, like, do not trust this man. I've been dehumanized enough for one weekend. Like, she'll first be texting, wow, these guys sound like heroes on their podcast. And then a few hours later, she's like, I've been crying in the car for 2 hours. Um, she texted like, I've been humiliated enough for one weekend. I don't think I'll ever respect myself again. I mean, it's just like the descent in this, you know, um, hostile relationship. I mean, it was just like tragic. I'm reading this on a phone, like unearthing it like it's an experimental novel. Um, but those women talked about the reality behind these guys' lives, that uh, they would say women shouldn't have jobs, but these guys didn't have jobs. They just podcasted, and all the women would work to support them, including Samantha. Samantha was dating Elliot Klein of Identity Europa. And when they broke up, he begged her to keep up the appearance that they were still in a relationship because it was important to his image within the white nationalist movement. Another woman told me that a guy had been almost crying to her that he would never have this like family life. He'd never have the white picket fence in the house and the kids and all of that. And she told him, I have a good income. Like, we can have that. And he just coldly stopped and looked at her and said, shut the fuck up. Like, it was just, I don't know. I mean, this was honestly, though I posed no actual threat of violence to me, like going through this phone was one of the like darkest experiences I've ever had as a journalist.
So, what do you think drew the women to the movement as opposed to the men? Because the men were sort of seeking status,
Mhm.
um, and they viewed themselves as this defender of Western white civilization. But the women joined a movement that was inherently, sort of toxic, hostile, and violent towards them. So where's sort of that disconnect?
They were brought in by this image strategically projected by the alt-right to not be this Jeff Scoop style skinhead like thugs, right? It was to be these like classy, educated intellectuals. So some of them watched Richard Spencer on YouTube. Samantha was brought in through Identity Europa, which they're the ones who wore the white polos. They had a policy of no racial slurs publicly. And privately, they're all making Holocaust jokes, of course. Um, but they liked this idea of a traditional family. Some of them had had emotionally or physically abusive relationships or other traumas like that. One woman told me, she once thought she was stupid, that she deserved to be treated that way. But a lot of them like this idea of a traditional happy family. I mean, that's the undercurrent that they don't say, right? They'll post these images of beautiful women in wheat fields at sunset. It's like always in a wheat field, right? Or an idealized blonde family with a like strong man, a demure woman like draped over him, and two beautiful children. And those, right, they represent happiness and ease and not the disconnect and the anxiety of, modern society. Of course,
So
they
you
don't
kind of
actually
saw it.
find that.
Yeah. So what you're saying, or at least, correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of feels like they were almost looking for um, an escape almost from their own sort of reality, or trying to have or having to face, the idea of, I got to be a productive member of society. I have to go and get a job. I have to, do all these things, when instead I can just, live this idyllic lifestyle from, the 1950s or 1960s. Everything looks like The Sound of Music, sort of thing, and it'll be easy, it'll be happy, and we'll live happily ever after.
Yeah. One woman told me that in a way, it's almost easier to be objectified because you can just let go and you don't have to grapple with why someone you liked is mistreating you. If you just tell yourself you deserve it, that can be easier to live with than having to think about, like, how could this person do this wrong thing to me?
Yeah. Another thing I noticed with that chapter is that it really started sort of to lay the groundwork for, sort of the finales that I kind of took from this book. Um, that being, Unite the Right in 2017 in Charlottesville, and January 6th, from about 3.5 years ago. I want to briefly touch on Unite the Right before we move on to the Q&A section of this event. Um, so you kind of encapsulate a lot of Unite the Right as this kind of perfect storm of conditions. Um, One, the entire chapter was a page turner, so I think that's a testament to your writing, number one. Um, and then two, when I was reading it, I couldn't help but notice the way that you sort of juxtapose some of these characters, to one another. Specifically when you talk about, the likes of Ethan Klein, Matthew Heimbach, Chris Cantwell, who is famously the crying Nazi now. Um, so in that sense, when you contrasted some of these personalities between these people, do you think that Unite the Right was a contradictory, sort of event? And I mean that insofar as to say the movement metastasized from the internet into the streets of, some liberal college town in Virginia, but there wasn't any real leadership. It was very disparate, and I felt like there were too many chefs in the kitchen, for lack of a better term. Because you said, I think there was a direct quote where somebody looked at, Chris Cantwell, and he asked them who's in charge, and he said nobody's in charge.
Yeah.
And you had all these sort of competing personalities. Um, so what do you think that says about, the movement? Because you had people like Spencer, Heimbach, Klein, um, Cantwell, all these people sort of come together, and there was no cohesion. So what do you think that said about the movement and these organizations that were sort of, front and center within that movement.
Right. So there was a massive federal civil lawsuit against these guys filed by people who'd argued cases at the Supreme Court. And I remember when it was filed thinking like, oh man, you guys have no idea that there's not some mastermind. Like you guys are going to be in for a harsh reality. I know that case was very valuable because it provided a lot of discovery. It showed all their internal communications. But I think the main takeaway is that these extremist movements are kind of like cults, but the leader does not control the cult. The cult controls the leader. The leaders are more like figureheads. Richard Spencer bitterly complained to me that they just wanted a dancing monkey for him. Matt Heimbach and Matt Parrott both said they were like patient zero in the trolling potential of the alt-right because they thought they were leading a populist movement, but they didn't actually understand what they were getting involved with. If you step outside the bounds of what the mob wants, it will rebel against you. And so there was no Jeff Scoop type figure to say, like, hey, don't talk about violence. Like, you're going to get us in legal trouble, right? So all this frenzy and energy finally materializes in real life and they go crazy. I mean, there's brawls in the street, there's photos of a guy choking a woman. There's no one putting any brakes on. And James Alex Fields, who murdered Heather Heyer by running his car into her, he had been sharing memes of cars running into protesters, right? They had this opportunity to make the internet into reality, but it had these disastrous physical consequences that you don't have on the internet.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Um, so I think that's going to sort of, put the cap on our, formal section of this, and we can take some questions from the audience. And there's a couple that I want to hit on. The first one is, can you explain how Frederick Brennan eventually grew to resent his creation of 8chan and what sort of prompted that change?
So as all of these sites, Twitter, whatever, there's like two major problems. Okay, child sexual abuse material, often called child porn, and hate speech. And in America, only one of those is legal. But in Europe, both of them are. And so, as a moderator, Frederick was constantly having to deal with requests from other governments to take down this stuff. And in order to be liked by his followers, he had to take the most extreme position possible, defying the commands of the Russian government, the Australian government, um, because revenge porn, non-consensual pornography, was still allowed in America. When it was requested to be taken down in Australia, he said that Australia was an authoritarian shithole, right? So he he might be publicly saying all this stuff is, holding this line, but behind the scenes, he's starting to not want to have to defend like hate speech. He didn't want to have to get in the comments and see whether an image was on the line of child porn. He didn't want to have to deal with those people. He had attached himself to the worst part of the internet. And then his boss, he felt like took advantage of him, burst into his home when he was naked and screamed at him. And he was, of course, a very vulnerable person because of his disability. So he resigned from that company. And at the beginning, he thought QAnon was just a silly thing, uh, but then watched it grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the mass shooters started posting their manifestos on the site. And it was finally a mass shooting in El Paso, where he called for 8chan to be taken down. And then once QAnon got really intense, he started working very hard to out his former boss, who now owned 8chan, as the person at least in charge of the voice of Q. And so by revealing his identity, he's able to create consequences for that person.
Yeah, that's all a very interesting rabbit hole. Um, so there's another question. With the rise of white nationalism in the US, it seems to have been accompanied by similar movements in Europe. Do you think this is a coincidence, or is the ideology contagious? Or was the US media late on picking up, the existence of this ideology elsewhere? Um, or is there another explanation?
Oh, wow. That's a combo. I mean, I definitely kind of had trouble pitching like European far right ideology. There are definitely um, there's a whole network of nonprofit organizations in Europe that are tied to Alexander Dugin. He's the political philosopher with nebulous ties to Vladimir Putin, and they put out a lot of this like neo-fascist ideas, which also, and they all interact with American white nationalists such as Richard Spencer. So there is this exchange of ideas. Spencer tried to host a meeting of the minds in Budapest in 2014, and it was shut down, and he was arrested by police and asked about his ties to Alexander Dugin. Um, but I spoke to a Hungarian official who had been involved in Jobbik, Jobbik. It's this far-right Hungarian party, kind of like if the alt-right were a political party that actually gained seats in the Hungarian parliament. They had called for like counting the Jews. Um, and they had also flirted with Russia. And this person described me sort of feeling like he was a big player in the game. They're really making progress. They went to Russia and they met with Russian officials. And it was in those meetings that he realized he wasn't the player in the game, he was just a pawn. Um, that there was an insinuation that maybe they could help stage protests in Ukraine in defense of Hungarian minorities. Um, so that guy now, um, when I spoke to him, they were working to make a coalition with the far left and center to oppose Viktor Orban. What he described to me was he said that he thought that 1984 was about communism, but no, it was about Orbanism, that the lockstep um, like propaganda in Hungary was far beyond what it had been under communism. And what he said was, he had initially been driven by a big scandal of the dominant liberal political party in Hungary, and that had been what allowed them to come to power. Likewise, I talked to a guy who worked with AfD in Germany, and he too
Hmm.
had been radicalized by like the financial crisis. So there's like this big event, and they start seeking different explanations for why what's happening is happening. And then once inside, they often find like their ideal, like the sort of dark side of their ideals, and it's already too late.
So that I think that's a good segue for me to ask about, where are some of these people now? Like, what are some of your characters that you feature in the book doing? Like, where's Richard Spencer? Where's sort of, Heimbach, Parrott,
Yeah.
Klein?
Richard Spencer has denounced, he says he's no longer a white nationalist. It's not entirely clear whether he's still a fascist or not. But he endorsed Biden, he opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He listed on his Bumble profile that his politics were moderate. He is working to establish a new religion that will destroy Christianity based on a worship of the god Apollo, a god of beauty, strength, and intellect. So his grand ambitions have not diminished, but as he put it to me, you have to get past the race stuff. Matt
Sounds pretty
Parr.
fashy to me, but I'll digress.
Yeah. Uh, Matt Parrott now says that he made a grave moral error going to Charlottesville, that he had known that he was working with unsavory figures and he did it anyway. But he's still a white nationalist, and he was kind of involved in some of these like anti-Semitic Twitter campaigns post October 7th, like ban the
Hmm.
ADL, which Elon Musk interacted with. Matt Heimbach has renounced white nationalism, says he's a Marxist-Leninist, lives with his kids. He's retreated from public life. Fred Brennan makes fonts in Atlantic City.
It's quite the, sort of it runs the gamut, I
Mhm.
guess. as far as their post alt-right careers look like. Um, there's two questions about sort of incel culture that I want to hit on here. So the first one I think is a really good one. Has the addition of incel culture to the white nationalist movement caused older white nationalists to leave? Because I think the incel thing is, a very contemporary sort of thing
Yeah.
that kind of clashes with the sort of old white men of yore in, the movement, such as the Jared Taylors and David Dukes. So what's that interaction been like between the new sort of incel pilled culture and the old guard?
Okay, so I guess the short answer is no. So the Jared Taylor types, the Peter Brimlows, they are all still in the game. They're always looking for new young energy to propel them forward. You do see a lot of white nationalists as they hit their 20s and 30s, like washing out of it because, you just greet reality, right? It's actually possible to have kids. Like Matt Heimbach called his children the most de-radicalizing force in his life, in part just because if he's homeless, couch surfing, that means they are too.
Yeah.
Um, but you absolutely see this super misogynist like element, like in the new right part of the conservative movement. I mean, obviously, JD Vance talked about childless cat women. I can't tell you how many times people would tweet that at me that I was going to die a childless cat woman, like that phrase. You know, does that mean JD Vance was like an edgelord? I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that, but he seems to be in circles where those ideas are pinging around and are not unusual.
Hmm. So kind of going back, to the incels again. Are they still active on, 8kun or 4chan or any of, is Wizard Chan still a thing?
There's no more Wizard Chan. Like some of their sites have been taken down, but the new ones emerge. I first profiled an incel named Joey in 2018, and you know, part of me thought like he's going to see himself on camera and see, and it'll be a reality check. Like for one thing, he's not so ugly that he could never have a relationship. It's crazy. He's totally normally looking. He's totally normal uh, normal ability to articulate himself. But like in the summer of 2021, he messages me at like 7 a.m. He's been up all night drinking wine, eating benzos, and in this incel forum that he's never left. A few months ago, maybe a year ago, he told me he was going to Europe to meet one of the older guys from inside his incel forum, and I haven't heard from him since then. But many of the people involved in that world talk about how it is a trap. Like once you get addicted to this, even if you hate it, on a much bigger scale than people who call Twitter a hell site. Like it's an absolutely miserable experience, and yet they spend 18 hours a day in there.
Yeah. So with, sort of the Chans falling out of favor, I guess. This is another audience question. Where do you think the most sort of violent corners of the internet are now? For me, I usually point towards Telegram, Discord, some of these WhatsApp groups. Is that something that you would, concur with?
Yeah, they're all on Telegram, and Telegram makes it really easy to forward messages between channels. Um, so there, and then like dark social, right? Like Discord servers that aren't public, so it's kind of hard to go into. But also, a lot of people are now they're back on Twitter. I mean, I wouldn't
Yeah.
call them violent, but like more extremists, they've been popping back up on Twitter. And I think also fascist or fascism curious types don't feel as much of a need to be anonymous anymore.
Yeah, my Twitter timeline is taking a dive for the worse.
Right.
In the last year and a half or so, and it just the sort of overt, outright Nazism. You
Mhm.
had Andrew Anglin, who was allowed back on, and you had Nick Fuentes, who was allowed back on. I think they both, since been banned and unbanned multiple times. Um, but still, I think they still have an audience, and their audience is going to go wherever they are, to
Mhm.
get that satisfying sort of content from them.
Right. Well, I know that several of them told me they never leave Twitter because that's where the liberals and the journalists were. And you don't want to, if you're a troll, you don't want to live in a pool of just trolls. You need somebody to troll. You need someone to enrage and to interact with and to play off of and to resent.
Yeah. So this will be my last question. Um, so what do you think the way forward is for the media in covering these sorts of things? What are sort of, the ethical concerns that journalists kind of have to take when they want to write a story about some of these people without, giving them, the undue, the platforming or the undue sort of influence or giving them the time of the day? How did you kind of manage that, and where do you think journalists kind of fall short in doing that?
Sure. Well, I always got very frustrated with the platforming debate because, if you ignore it, they don't go away. First of all, they've got all their own media, so they'll be able to talk to each other even if the media ignores it. And I think the worst example of this is, of course, QAnon, where there was very little public, like establishment media coverage of it until January 6th. I mean, there were massive demonstrations for Stop the Steal leading up to Jan 6th, and they got relatively little coverage considering what they were about. Um, I think you don't interview a white nationalist as though they're a senator. Their ideas are not particularly new or earth-shattering. But I think it's important to show the way that they're adapting, like a virus, and what things they're doing that are starting to pick up um, more members. Like, what are their tactics that are able to draw in more people? One fascist told me that one of their tactics was to post seemingly innocuous slogans that the media would be outraged by, like, it's okay to be white. And people who weren't read into it would then say, well, what's wrong with saying it's okay to be white? And that's how they would get more people. I think there needs to be more faith in the level of knowledge the audience has, that actually we can
Hmm.
talk to people like they're smart and we can get more details and more in depth. Um, and I mean, and to be more skeptical. Similar to It's Okay to Be White, there's a idea that was bouncing around the Chans a few years ago, White Boy Summer. Well, in June, that's being handed out from stage at Turning Point Conference. That's this conservative group where Donald Trump has spoken multiple times. Like, that deserves attention. And to raise the question, like, what are you trying to say by that? Who are you trying to appeal to?
Yeah. Well, we, in observing time, I think that will conclude our, Q&A and our session more broadly. So firstly, I want to say thank you, Ellie, for, taking the time out of your day. You're a busy journalist and correspondent over at CNN, so there's a lot of things you could be doing, but you chose to be here with us and give our audience, an excellent experience to talk about your book. And again, congratulations on the book. It's excellent. I enjoyed reading it, and I think the audience will too. Is there anything that you would like to plug, or where can our audience find you outside of this Zoom webinar?
I am on Twitter. Just search for Ellie Reeve. CNN, it might be on tonight, not sure. And I just wanted to thank you and the program, the collection of documents. What you guys do is very vital to my work. So I greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, folks, that'll be it for today. Again, help us thank Ellie Reeve for coming on by buying her book and following her on Twitter. This recording will be available later on YouTube, so if you missed it, you can go back and watch it. And be sure to stay tuned for all of the program's future events. We send out emails and reminders fairly often, so check your inboxes. Ellie, thank you again. We greatly appreciate it, and we'll look forward to speaking to you next time.
Thank you so much.